After several years of buying, refurbishing, and reselling vintage audio, I'll be honest with you, I kind of got to the point where I started to hate vintage audio and promised myself I would stop buying it. But in a moment of weakness, I stumbled on this Pioneer SX980 receiver at my local record store and bought it. Now on my drive home, I immediately started to remind myself of all the reasons why I stopped buying vintage gear. It's always breaking. It requires constant maintenance like cleaning or installing new lights. If it does break, there's not a shop around me to repair it, and oftentimes it's just too big for my listening room. In short, I started to doubt myself for buying this receiver. Oh man, have I made another huge mistake? Now, I forgot just how big the 980 actually is. I also own an SX780 receiver that my sons use in their stereo setup, and it's a much more normal size receiver. Sure, Pioneer has made larger beast size units like the 1080 or the 1250, and I know those things are really huge, but I really thought this 980 was smaller than it turned out to be. I use an IKEA Kallax shelf for both my record storage and my audio setup. I basically lay it on its side and set the audio gear up on the side. I measured the depth of the shelf and got kind of nervous because I realized it was very close to the depth of the 980 receiver. If this receiver doesn't fit on this shelf, I'm kind of screwed because I'm not replacing this. That's also storing all of my records. Thankfully, after taking down my other stereo gear and hefting up the 980, it just barely fit. The actual dimensions of the receiver are 21 inches wide by 16 inches deep by 7 inches in height. But now that I know it fits, the big question is, does it work? Let me grab the camera and get a close-up of the front of the unit and show you some of the features, and we'll make sure everything is working as it should. Now that we've got a close-up of the unit here, let's first power it on, see if it works. Now the store said everything worked fine, and I believe them, but with vintage gear you can literally have it working one day, put it in your car, take it somewhere, and the next day it just, something weird happens, it doesn't work. So first thing, flip it on. Took a minute, but hopefully you heard that click. That's the relay clicking, which is a good sound, which means we're probably going to get audio here. I'm going to test just this FM here and probably have it on a non-music station so I don't get any copyright flags here. But
everybody involved, right? I mean, how many emails have you gotten?
Good deal. We got sound. That's a good sign. One thing I noticed with this 980 is the FM reception on this is really good. Where I'm located, I get really crappy FM without an antenna. This doesn't have an antenna hooked up, and I get most of the strong power channels really easily. Now, the store told me that some of the lights were out, and I can see that it's got the factory sort of orange lights in here. I will actually probably replace these with a cool white color. It just kind of has a cleaner look to it. I did that on a Pioneer SX450 and it turned out looking really great. So I'll probably do that because it looks like I'm gonna have to go in and replace the selection lights. AM is the one that's working. No FM light, no aux light, no phono. And I'm not sure on the stereo one, but I don't really get the best stereo in here. So that doesn't usually light up on previous receivers I've had, but I'll go in and probably just replace that. I'll just replace them all while I'm in there, which isn't my most favorite thing to do, but you know, we'll take it apart, get in there and do that. So they told me those lights were out, so that's not a huge surprise. Now looking at the front of the unit, the first thing you'll notice is that this has this black background here on the meter switches and the signal and tuning. Now that is an upgrade on the 980 versus the 950, which had a white background, and so this black background just pops a little bit more for those meters, which people can tend to enjoy more than they were on the 950. But looking at the front, you've got your power switch here, headphones, speakers A and B, some filter switches up here, FM muting, and then obviously you've got your selector switches, FM, AM, aux, phono 2 and phono 1, and the nice big tuning dial there. You've got tone controls here, so you've got bass, treble. You've got the ability just to turn those off or on. When you turn them on, you can go crazy there and set them however you would like. You've got your tape monitor switches here, and a stereo mono switch there. You've got loudness on or off. Well, that's off and that's on. Balance your speakers left and right, and you got your volume knob, which has a nice little sound to it when adjusting. I really like that clicking sound. Some people might not, but I do. And you got a muting switch here. You've even got the ability to install a microphone should you choose to want to. Now, let me turn the unit around. Let's look at the features on the back of the unit. Now, looking at the rear of the unit, it's going to look pretty familiar to most other receivers. You got your AM antenna here, your FM connectors there. You can hook up 2 turntables with a Phono 1 and Phono 2. The ground connections are there. You can hook up something here in the auxiliary input. You've got your tape 1 and tape 2. So you think about when this unit came out, probably 1978 or so, that would probably be a cassette deck and a reel-to-reel. There's an FM de-emphasis switch here. Now, this unit has the ability to be separated by removing these jacks here, these connectors. When you remove these, you're not going to have any sound from the unit. You can then use it as either a preamp only or a power amp only. Now, I made a video to show you how to actually make these connections, and it was one of the first videos I made. And when I hooked up the preamp, just to use your vintage receiver as a preamp only, I got that right, but I kind of goofed on the using it as a power amp. But there's a link in that video to a blog post that I made showing you how to make these connections. But if you buy this 980, you can actually use this as a preamp only or a power amp only via these connectors. And the manual actually shows you how to do that as well. Now, this can connect 2 sets of speakers. You got speakers A and speakers B. It's worth noting that if you use just speakers A or B, they can go all the way down to 4 ohms and up. But if you're going to use 2 sets of speakers at the same time, A plus B, you have to use 8 ohm speakers or more. Now, you've got these AC outlets here, so you can hook up units, where if this is switched on, you can use the unit and these unswitched. Now, there's this really funny thing in the manual that has a warning, a specific warning that says not to hook up an iron or a toaster to these. I'm not sure why they have to be that specific in the manual for an iron or a toaster, but I guess that means at some point somebody hooked up an iron or a toaster to this and, I don't know, probably blew up the unit. But it cracked me up. I'm trying to imagine walking into somebody's kitchen and seeing this sitting on the counter with somebody running a toaster out of it. But I don't know. I'm sure somebody did it once and it made them put it in the manual going forward. So that's the back of the unit. Now that we've done this, let's turn it back around and talk a little bit about how it sounds. The SX980 rates at 80 watts per channel. And I'll be honest with you, it's been a while since I've used a receiver with that much power. I would say the closest thing I've probably used is my Marantz 2270, which comes in at 70 watts per channel. I've also made a video about the Marantz 2270, which I will include a link to in the description below. Now, before I go too deep into talking about how the 980 sounds, vintage audio fans are going to point out to me, and I will agree with them, that I should really be using more power-hungry speakers for this high wattage receiver. Something along the lines of Pioneer HPM 100s or classic JBL speakers. Now, I used to actually own a pair of HPM 100s. The problem with those speakers is that they're so huge that I have trouble positioning them in my small listening space that doesn't end up with the sound being way too muddy. So I will agree with you that I should probably use more power-hungry speakers. And therefore, if you're using something along those lines, your listening experience with this receiver will probably be even better than mine. For now, I'm listening to this receiver using my more modern Klipsch bookshelf speakers. And the thing that I noticed immediately was the large bass response that I haven't been getting with my more modern gear. Now, it's worth pointing out that I have the loudness button selected on the 980, which allows for a larger bass response when listening in a smaller room like this at lower volumes. And that loudness button is not something that's offered on today's more modern gear. Now, one question that I always ask myself when I'm reviewing receivers with tone controls is it really worth pointing out the treble response when you've got all these tone controls in place so that you can adjust the treble to where you like it? For me, the treble sounded great, but it kind of seems strange to me, like all you have to do is, if you don't like the way the treble sounds right out of the box, just adjust the tone control up or down to how you prefer to hear it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the treble because, hey, you can go in there and adjust it to however you would like to hear it. Lastly, and most importantly, I noticed that I barely have to turn the volume knob before the sound just gets too loud. Honestly, like a quarter of a turn up and the sound is right there. Like if I go any louder, it's really too loud for my listening space. Now, vintage audio fans have a certain expectation of what vintage audio will sound like. So for anyone that loves that vintage audio sound, you're going to get that same feeling listening to the SX980. So if that's something you love, you will never regret adding a 980 to your collection. But what about me? Did I make a bad decision buying this receiver? Next, I'm going to tell you what I paid for the unit, any outstanding issues I've noticed after a few days of use, and we'll use that to determine whether or not my choice was good or bad. Now, before I tell you what I paid for the unit, let me point out just a couple of the issues that I've noticed after a few days of use. I've already pointed out the selector lights that are out, and in fairness, the store told me that a few of the light bulbs were not working, so I wasn't surprised when I got those home and those were not working correctly. Now, the one thing I have noticed is when using the Phono 1 input, I'm actually getting really weak sound out of the right channel. And what I noticed is if I press the Phono input button in and hold it in, that sound returns as it properly should in that channel. So this means I probably need to get the deoxit out, take the top off, and get in there and clean that switch really good. I just really hope that switch is easy to get to. So far, that's the only issue that I've had with this receiver. Now, as promised, I'm going to tell you what I paid for the receiver. With tax, $650, which I actually think is a pretty reasonable price. Now, we would all love to find these at a garage sale for $50 or a thrift store for $10, but the reality is most people are aware that these are worth money these days, and so finding them at that kind of a great deal has gotten really, really hard. So to find it in the store for $650, I thought was very fair. Looking at eBay solds, they range between $600 and $1,500, but you have to remember this is a very large unit, so you're paying on top of that at least $100 or more just to have it shipped to you. Now, it's never smart to look at what the for sale prices are on eBay because those are usually jacked way up and people don't buy them at that price. But let's say that I was lazy and just impatient and wanted to buy one right now and didn't care what I was going to pay on eBay. Well, the cheapest one that I found on there was still under $1,000, and again, it's going to be $100 to ship. So, in short, $650, not that bad of a price. And more importantly, it felt really great for me to buy it direct from my local record store because that's a pretty big purchase, and to be able to give that money to a small business locally next to me was a really great feeling. So, to answer my big question, did I make a huge mistake buying this receiver? In short, I don't think so. Again, at $650, I think it's a great price. Again, it felt great buying it from my local record store. Honestly, after I fix the burned out lights and get that Phono 1 input cleaned out and working again, if I were to ever consider selling the unit, which I probably won't, but if I did, I could easily get that $650 back, maybe even more. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I also own a Marantz 2270 receiver. It was actually the first piece of vintage gear that I ever bought. If you're interested in learning more about that receiver, you can do so by watching this video here.